Good evening, everyone. I'm Margaret Kelleher, Chair of Anglo-Irish Literature and Drama here at UCD, and it's my great pleasure on behalf of colleagues from the School of English, Film and Drama to welcome you here this evening for this evening's lecture by Eiléan Chuilleanáin as Ireland Professor of Poetry. It's also a chance for us in the school to express our warm esteem for her distinguished year with us this year and to express our deep thanks. I'd like to begin by briefly introducing the context of tonight's lecture. I think as many of you indeed know in this room, the Ireland Chair of Poetry Trust was established in 1998 following the 1995 award of the Nobel Prize of Literature to Seamus Heaney, and it's jointly held between Queen's University Belfast, Trinity College Dublin, University College Dublin, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland and the Arts Council on Comhairle Eiléan. It was the first ever cross-border chair, and I'd especially like to welcome members of the Board of Trustees who are here this evening, Sarah Bannon and Stephanie O'Callaghan, who are representing the Arts Council, and the many distinguished holders of the chair. It's a particular delight to see you here. In the words of former Chair of the Board of Trustees, Bob Collins, the chair recognises the poetic tradition on the island of Ireland and the value and vitality of the poetic community. And crucially, it proclaims the enduring importance of the prophetic voice of the poet and re-centres poetry in the public life of the people. Since its inception, it's been held by John Montague, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, Paul Durcan, Michael Longley, Harry Clifton, Paul Eiléan, and most recently Eiléan Chuilleanáin. And during their tenure, holders teach in each of the three universities, as Eiléan has been doing here for the past year in UCD. Additionally, an annual Chair of Poetry bursary is awarded to a poet of promise, along with an annual student prize. I'd just like to take a moment as a teacher and reader of literature myself to pay tribute to another aspect of the initiative, which is the publication of the lectures as an elegant essay series produced by University College Dublin Press entitled The Poet's Chair. Recently, I was asked to write an essay on literature and public value, and I turned to these volumes and discovered to my great pleasure that they defied easy pilfering for statements on public value. But I found much more. In fact, they're a literary and cultural treasure trove, drawing from each poet's individual preoccupations, but with recurring subjects such as a strong insistence on the European dimensions of Irish writing, both as poetic source and as literary audience. Thus, John Montague's subject is the poet and his community, including the challenges and rewards of poetic translation. Paul Durcan discusses the influence of his contemporaries Anthony Cronin, Michael Hartnett and Harry Clifton as three European poets. And Harry Clifton has provided a transnational scrutiny of Ireland and its elsewheres, of Britain, Europe and the United States. The essays by Michael Longley, Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill and Paul Eiléan focus on the creative imagination and the remarkable breadth of cultural references from which they draw, the classics and natural history by Longley, folklore archives by Ní Dhomhnaill, geological and genetical findings by Meehan, attest to the dynamic and diverse sources of their literary inspiration. To be a poet is to be alive to both precursors and contemporaries, Michael Longley observes, and as I look around the audience, that's a fitting note for this evening's gathering. Professor Eiléan Chuilleanáin was born in Cork, educated there and at Oxford before her academic life in the School of English, Trinity College Dublin. She's a Fellow and Professor of English Emerita at Trinity and a member of Eiléan. In her academic life, she's been a highly influential and illuminating scholar of Renaissance literature of the English Reformation, of translation studies, of folklore studies, and an editor and scholar on the work of Maria Edgeworth. Her poetry collections range from Acts and Monuments, 1972, Site of Ambush, The Second Voyage, The Rose Geranium, The Magdalen Sermon, The Brazen Serpent, The Girl Who Married the Reindeer, The Sunfish, winner of the International Griffin Poetry Prize, and most recently, The Boys of Blue Hill. Other awards include the Patrick Kavanagh Award, the Irish Times Award for Poetry, and the O'Shaughnessy Award of the Irish American Cultural Institute. In her generous work as translator, she's opened up other linguistic and creative traditions to many readers in publications such as Legend of the Walled-Up Wife, translations from the Romanian of Eiléan Melanchiu, which appeared in 2011, and most recently in her very fine translations of Nuala Ní Gonal in the glorious Gallery Press published Northern Lights volume, recently published. To quote from Ní Chuilleanáin's poem The Cold from the collection The Sunfish, quote, "4 friendly words open their locks, memory and then alone, memorial and creation." These are words and spaces which soar and linger through Ní Chuilleanáin's work, accompanied and deepened so often by, to quote again from that poem, the word that has not been said. In Gloss, Close Gloss, a personal favourite from The Girl Who Married the Reindeer, the rags of language are streaming like weather veins, like weeds in water, they turn with the tide. She's been described by Angel Clare in The Guardian in a recent review of The Boys of Blue Hill as the Vermeer of contemporary poetry. And to quote from the citation to the O'Shaughnessy Award, in a comment which gestures to this evening's lecture, her poetry resonates with rights and presences. Before closing, I do again wish to relay the gratitude and deep esteem of colleagues here in UCD, where she's currently teaching a postgraduate seminar on Irish periodicals. Eiléan gave a most memorable interview and reading, a reading and interview with my colleague Lucy Collins to our big first year course, where she was fan-bombed in the Arts Cafe, a particularly dear memory. And it was a memorable and very moving reading and conversation about art, creativity and the imagination. Her title this evening is Instead of a Shrine, Poetry and Ritual. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eiléan Chuilleanáin.
Thank you very much indeed, Margaret, for all those kind words, and thanks to everybody for turning up on what turned out to be a colder night than expected. I'm going to start from a 17th century poem. It's one I've been thinking of recently, and indeed more than one person has drawn it to my attention in letters of condolence. It is the Exequy by Henry King, Bishop of Chichester, on the death of his 24-year-old wife, Anne. It's a splendid poem, one that I've known since I was an undergraduate, and returning to it has only increased my affection for it. King never wrote anything else as good. It's one of those pieces that shine out in anthologies, and I think for one generation after another, actually, at any rate, since Arthur Quiller Couch's Oxford Book of English Verse of 1903, I think. For one generation after another, it's become part of a climate of feeling. I want to talk a bit about this poem, and do forgive me for reverting to my academic pasture of the English 17th century, but I'm not going to stay on it. What I want to discuss first is how the poet of King's Exequy lets us know what he's aiming to do, tells what kind of poem this is, and thus what he thinks a poem can be, all of which is in the opening lines. And then I want to pursue his assumptions about what a poet can do into later centuries, looking at poems of the 19th and 20th centuries, and to ask, is his proposition true? Is it a general truth about poetry? Or does it just belong to the poems of a certain period and outlook? Because it certainly is marked by its period. And I should expand, I'm talking about what Henry King thinks a poem can be in the world and the historical moment in which he is alive, but also I'm looking at what we may think it can be from the point of view of our time and culture. Henry King did live through a momentous phase of English history. He was the son of an Elizabethan Bishop of London who became a bishop himself, something which clearly would not have been possible in the time before that. In his father's day, it seemed as if the great change in the religious culture of the country had happened and had been absorbed without, in the end, disrupting the whole state. Most people obeyed the same rules and prayed in the same churches as they had always known, even though the language and the theology had changed. And then it became clear that another, even larger convulsion was on the way, that the arguments that had seemed settled were going to be reopened, and that the Church of England was in the way of being more radically reformed than many of its clergy and laity wished, the advocates of reform being an opposing clergy and laity who felt that the Protestant Reformation had never been properly finished. So on one side of the divided house were people who thought that the Church was in thrall to a heap of scandalous observances that recalled the Church of Rome. On the other were those people to whom the small everyday rituals of the Church, those vestments and gestures that had survived the purges of the previous century, seemed harmless, familiar, and above all, decent. And the argument led in due course to a civil war. Henry King lost his diocese, his library, and his home, and lived almost in hiding for several years. This is all well after he wrote the poem, but the threat, I think, is there in it. Ritual was the contentious issue, and in particular, the bunch of rituals inherited from the Catholic Middle Ages, which brings me back to the first 4 lines of King's poem. Accept, thou shrine of my dead saint, instead of dirges this complaint, and for sweet flowers to crown thy hearse, receive a strew of weeping verse. In the first 2 lines, there are 12 words. I'll come back later to lines 3 and 4. And of those 12, 3 key words come from the recognizable medieval vocabulary of Catholics. A shrine preserves the relics of a saint and allows them to be venerated. The word dirge comes from the opening of a psalm, which was used in the Latin office for the dead, Dirige Domine Deus meus in conspectu tuo viam meam, Psalm 5. The first wave of the Reformation had as one of its most visible effects the destruction and looting and desecration of shrines. The veneration of saints was forbidden, and in the view of many people, funeral services became scarily plain affairs. And King is bundling all of these rejected ritual traps into the opening of his poem. So what, we may respond? This is a poet using a metaphor, as poets do. And he goes on in this poem to draw metaphors from many sources, from libraries, optics, geography, navigation, war. And anyway, some of these metaphors had already been co-opted or even parodied, shifted from a religious to an erotic context by many writers. A saint can mean a mistress. A dirge it can have its modern meaning of any dolorous song. Isn't that kind of switching of register just what poets do? But there's another word in that little opening couplet that I want to draw attention to, instead. Because I want to ask, is a poem in some way, and if so, in what way, a substitute for something else? Can it be a substitute for a ritual, for an element in the culture that is proscribed or perhaps obsolete, or at any rate, an element that is under some kind of pressure? And I suppose that also means is that a response, can that be a response in some cases to pressures of historical change? Henry King is writing as himself, as a prominent priest, an archdeacon, and a well-known preacher, although when he wrote this poem he wasn't yet a bishop. All those words that I've focused on gain a little extra weight from the known identity of the writer and from his publicly assumed position on the condition of the church. Like his friend John Donne, he rejected completely the claims of the Roman Church, and like him, he had no time for the party in the Church of England that wanted a more radical reformation. Donne had made, 10 years earlier, what is to me a very interesting comment on what poetry is allowed to do. He was dismissing the Catholic approach to public prayers. These lines occur in his second anniversary, written when he was travelling in France, in 1612, in fact. And he says about France, it is a place, he says it is, a place where misdevotion frames 1,000 prayers to saints whose very names the ancient church knew not, heaven knows not yet, and where what laws of poetry admit, laws of religion have at least the same. It's as if Donne saw public religion and poetry in opposition, even in competition with each other. He's also saying that the rules of poetry may properly allow what ought properly not to be allowed in the church. So I'm arguing you can have ritual as metaphor, ritual as action in poetry, perhaps because you have reduced, at any rate, the quantity of ritual in the church. He's talking about that other church, the Church of Rome, as it bureaucratically regulates public worship. And of course, he has another famous poem on exactly that subject, the Canonization, the one that everybody knows from its first line, for God's sake, hold your tongue. But which doesn't say, not addressed as some students have thought to his mistress. Never mind. Well, the Canonization is a marvellous poem. And in it, he claims the right of poetry, love poetry, to substitute itself for the writing of both history and hymns. So I'm pursuing this idea of poetry as something that comes in instead, as a substitute for something else. When Donne wrote the Canonization, he was probably not yet ordained, but we know that his studies in theology and in religious controversy occupied him long before his ordination. Canonization in the Roman Church was changing and developing in his lifetime. It was becoming much more official. This Vatican bureaucracy was, and the Pope, in fact, was claiming more control over it. And it already involved, at the time he was writing, the authorizing from above of a special office and feast day for a saint. So when Donne writes about his love, about the story of his love, and if unfit for tomb or hearse our legend be, it will be fit for verse, he's distinguishing between a legend, which is the life of a saint, and the sentimental story of two lovers. And he goes on to suggest that his love poems are the equivalent, the substitute, if you like, for the public office for a saint's feast day, when the faithful will pray to them for favours, invoke them as saints of love. And by these hymns all shall approve us canonized for love, and thus invoke us. And then I can't resist giving the stanza as a whole. And if unfit for tomb or hearse our legend be, it will be fit for verse. And if no piece of chronicle we prove, we'll build in sonnets pretty rooms, as well a well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs. And by these hymns all shall approve us canonized for love. Now, turning love into a religion was a popular game since the Middle Ages. But I'm finding, I think, that the parallel between the systems of poetry and religion is a live issue in the 17th century, in part because of the contemporary pressures, and that it involves this idea of substitution. For these poets, it sometimes seems, poetry compensates for a historical loss. It's a loss that they can't conscientiously deplore in the real world, but it's one that still aches and requires comfort in the fictitious world of poetry. I've said fictitious, and in saying that, I don't mean to deny that there's a great deal of excellent poetry which makes no use or little use of fiction. However, fiction is often the instrument that comes readiest to our hand as we write, sometimes even needing to be pushed aside with an impatient refusal, saying, "No, I just want to say literally what I mean, or what I saw, or literally what I have found in my source." And then there are moments in poetry when we're being asked to look at the literal truth, to look at it with such intensity, or to share the poet looking at it with such intensity, that the light that emanates from it becomes indistinguishable from the radiance of fiction, or of myth, or of ritual. And then, even when we're drawn into the contemplation of the literal, we still know that the poet is not under any obligation to stick to that kind of realistic truth throughout. So I need to give an example and to move forward in time of especially an example of what we might call realism. Walt Whitman's poem, A Sight in Camp, in the Daybreak, Grey and Dim. It's a poem I actually first encountered in Irish in the translation by Pádraic de Brún, but that's another story. A sight in camp, in the daybreak, grey and dim, as from my tent I emerge so early, sleepless. I walk in the cool, fresh air, the path nearby the hospital tent. 3 forms I see on stretchers lying, brought out there, untended, lying. Over each the blanket spread, ample brownish woolen blanket, grey and heavy blanket, folding, covering all. Curious I halt and silent stand, then with light fingers I from the face of the nearest, the first, just lift the blanket. Who are you, elderly man, so gaunt and grim, with well-greyed hair and flesh all sunken about the eyes? Who are you, my dear comrade? Then to the second I step, and who are you, my child and darling? Who are you, sweet boy, with cheeks yet blooming? Then to the third, a face nor child nor old, very calm, as of beautiful yellow-white ivory. Young man, I think I know you. I think this face is the face of the Christ himself, dead and divine and brother of all, and here again he lies. Now, I suppose it is obvious why I call this a poem that shadows a ritual, but let me dwell briefly on some details. There's the negative, to which the ritual is a response, because the bodies are untended, whereas we expect, it seems decent, that the bodies of the dead should be attended. Again, this is a poem with a poetic and a historical context, which makes the neglect understandable. We're in the middle of the American Civil War, and the attendants are preoccupied with the enormous task of helping the severely wounded to survive. The poet steps in, as he said in another poem in the same sequence where this one appears, The Wound Dresser. He says, I resigned myself to sit by the wounded and soothe them, or silently watch the dead. And Whitman in The Wound Dresser is also presenting his action as a substitute for something else, for writing militaristic poetry. Aroused and angry, I'd thought to beat the alarm and urge relentless war, but soon my fingers failed me, he says. Instead, he positions himself somewhere between the service to the living and the dead. If you can help a wounded man by sitting by him, that's a service to him. But watching the dead, the ritual of the wake, is also an acknowledgement of the needs of the greater number, the society, which wants the dead to be treated in a seemly fashion. And the huge funeral sentiment of the 19th century, the cult of mourning, is being transformed in Whitman's moment. My undertaker friend, the poet Thomas Lynch, has told me that the big American elaboration of his profession stems from the funerals of the Civil War. But this poem of Whitman's is based on that word, instead. It is not a funeral. He doesn't pray or shake holy water or conduct the bodies to a grave. He doesn't preach. He looks at them with an intensity of presence that is the mark of ritual. Like the three kings at the Christmas crib, the three bodies in that intense light become an image of humanity as a whole. And then again, the three are summed up in the figure of Christ, divine and dead. Because ritual is itself a substitution, an impersonation, in which, for example, the blanket becomes an image of the tomb. Three can stand for many. One can speak on behalf of a congregation. Ritual is a language. It needs a public that understands what's going on. It is expressive. It deals in the visible, in clothing, gestures, and also time frames, all of which are the conditions in which the human body operates. Poetry, too, like all language, exists in time, deals in the before and after, as I'll be showing in a minute. Not denying, this is a digression, that the poet can stand outside ritual to criticize it. Emily Dickinson comments on the standard symbols of mourning in the 19th century: a darker ribbon for a day, a crepe upon the hat. And then the pretty sunshine comes and helps us to forget. And of course, famously, the metaphor, I felt a funeral in my brain. But note, she's not talking about bereavement and its psychological impact. She's talking about the social rituals that make it recognizable to outsiders. Now, many poets like Dickinson comment on ritual. I'll be talking about some others. But Whitman, I think, is achieving something different. He's assembling an original ritual, and one that's valid for this one occasion only, for this poem only, this singular encounter between the poet's lonely presence and the unknown victims of a historical event. I think that as we read or hear this poem, we become conscious of its ritual action. It's a movement from absorbing a bit of autobiographical narrative to being aware that the poem itself is doing something. We become aware because we already know something about ritual, and in this case, about the customs surrounding death. We know probably, and Whitman's readers will have known, that these vary between religious and racial and political groups, and so they are in some sense invented. And we don't see Whitman's respectful, inventive interrogation of the dead faces as a transgression. We know we're dealing with a poem, not a witness statement under oath, and so we're not being asked, for example, to believe that there were three bodies only, or that they looked exactly as he described. we are asked to concur with the poet that what he does in the poem is solemn and has a serious meaning for all who are virtually present as readers. I don't want to spend time talking about theories of ritual, of which there are a few, but I'll mention my own theory, which is that a ritual is distinguished by the importance that it gives to presence and to difference. You notice that things like confession on the internet have never really caught on. Being there is a terribly important part of religious ritual. To appreciate it, you have to be there to take part. And presence is what saturates that Whitman poem, I think. It's about attending, about encounter. When it comes to difference, I should give a few examples, I think. We know that the Eucharistic meal, the Holy Communion, like the Passover meal on which it's based, is different from an ordinary meal. The question that's asked at Passover is, how is this night different from all other nights? To take George Herbert's Eucharistic poem, Love, it's set up as a conversation between a host and an awkward guest. It ends, so I did sit and eat, but we know that what the poem refers to is not an ordinary case of hospitality, and neither does it merely refer to the communion service. It differs from both. It's a one-off construction of the poet that refers to both and to the gospel parables about feasts and hosts and guests. Its individual existence is as a poem, and it's as a poem that it draws on our sense of social and religious ritual. For example, how you behave if you're somebody's guest. And it calls on us to recognize a poem has its own kind of difference. Now, I've been talking about the religious poets of the 17th century, but I hope that what I've said about the poem by Whitman suggests that it's possible, without belonging to an elaborate orthodoxy. Whitman was raised as a Quaker. It's possible to write poetry that creates rituals and reminds readers of how we respond to symbolic behaviour in so many aspects of our lives, as we do with social custom. And this brings us up against the issue of folklore. A lot of bad poetry has been written about folk beliefs, especially in Ireland, but we should remember that there are many good poems too. And here we arrive at poetry that is about ritual rather than instead of something else. To give an example, Pierce Hutchinson's Bright After Dark has something to say about symbolic action in a form that looks like a straight comparison of folk customs in three different cultures. Characteristically for him, he places the Irish custom between those of two other countries. None of the three are named in the poem. I want to quote the second and third section of the poem, which are about Ireland and then about Guatemala. In the second country, when you send a child out of the house at night, you must, if you wish it well, take from the fire a burnt-out cinder and place it on the palm of the child's hand to guard the child against the dangers of the dark. The cinder in this good function is called angel, meaning angel. In the third country, if you take a journey at night, above all in the black night of ebony, so good for witches to work in, you dare not rely on fireflies for light, for theirs is a brief, inconstant glow. What you must hope is that somebody before you has dropped grains of maize on the ground to light your way, and you must drop grains of maize for whoever comes after you, for only maize can light the way on a dark light. The idea of calling the cinder an angel he found in Deneen's Irish English Dictionary of 1927, a burnt out, under Angel it says, a burnt out cinder taken from the fire, sometimes given in their hands as a protection to children going out at night. You've noticed perhaps that the religious idea of the guardian angel has been appropriated for the cinder charm, and that both of the customs described are dependent on shared beliefs and shared concerns. You must hope that whoever passed before you knew about the maze and cared enough to scatter it. And our elders, those who passed before us in the other sense, passed their customs on to the next generation. Putting the cooled, safe cinder in the child's hand to convince it that it will be safe, it's the transfer of a small knot of understanding into the future. It's, I think, specific to Irish culture, but its placing in Pierce Hutchinson's poem makes the point that this people of ours exists in a various world on equal terms. If we know this poet, we know that the grouping of three peoples from Europe and beyond does not allow any of them to be called backward or superstitious. For everyone, darkness suggests unease, children are fragile, and cooperation is important. So his ritual about safety. Certainly in that poem, the safe place is home indoors, and the dangers to be addressed by custom and ritual are outside. The difference, I suppose, between custom and ritual is that ritual is meant to be effectual in some way. And I think that's one of the things I'm arguing that poetry is doing. It's being, or setting out to be, effectual. The form of Hutchinson's poem, like the progression of Whitman's A Sight in Camp, tells us something else about ritual. It proceeds in defined stages. Because although Hutchinson seems to be simply placing three instances of folk belief side by side, the threeness of the shape of the piece creates an accumulation, something that would not have happened, I think, if his instances had been 2 or 5. But Bright After Dark is an about poem. It concentrates on the eternal present of folklore, rather than the stages in time that mark ritual itself. The stages of progression are part of many rituals, and this is another digression. When I was reading the poems of R.S. Thomas for this lecture, I was disappointed to find that he rarely enough addresses ritual directly. And then I noticed the titles of his poems. They have names like Threshold, Gradual. A gradual is, of course, a prayer that is said on the steps of a pulpit. There is allusion then in Thomas to the stages of ritual, and I haven't studied him all that closely, so maybe I shouldn't be talking about him at all. But he's not someone, I think, who takes the structure of ritual into his poems. To go back to Pierce Hutchinson's poem, it's telling us that it is possible to carry something of home with us into the fearful and chaotic outer world. The focus is on the threshold between the inside and the outside, and the keeping at a distance those forces that are dangerous or perhaps unclean. Ritual itself is rather different, I think. Instead of taking up residence on that threshold, it moves across it. So we wash or sprinkle water if we enter a temple, a mosque, or a church. Complicated ceremonial rules may decide who is allowed to enter, which is a theme I'll come back to. My point just now is that this has little to do with any spiritual dimension. It's about physical boundaries, physical safety, and bodily gestures. Involvement of the material and bodily makes ritual recognizable. If Whitman had not stressed the moving of the blanket, if the blanket hadn't been so palpable in its ample grey-brown, his poem, I think, would have fallen apart. Thomas Kinsella's poem, Ceremony, makes a point about this, and it's also what I would call an instead poem, in that it describes, or perhaps better explores, the entry into a church, which is not particularly a safe space, but is a place that could hardly be more firmly distinguished from the outside, the ordinary world. The poet's awareness is also different. His refusal to make anything transcendent of the experience, to go beyond the physical, the pious presences, the shadowy believers are important here because they share the place with him. But there is a difference between them. And they're also sharing a system of signs that tells us what place this is. And the reader is invited to share and recognize, for example, the bowl of blood, which is the sanctuary lamp. Ceremony. I am kneeling before the altar under the bowl of blood with the seed of living light. I am yielding to an impulse growing in the cold mornings as I passed the great blank door and walked through the high darkness, in among the pious presences, praying among their candles, to kneel at the marble rail with my palms placed together before the hidden host. It is accomplished. I find that I am considering the detail in the cold stone, awareness of the body, the breath warm on my fingers, my knees damp and chill. I will return through the high dark, among the shadowy believers, to the orderly interests of the day. Now, there's a characteristic restraint and reticence of this poem, and there's the tightness of its forms and the cool immediacy of what it describes. But all this, I think, calls attention to a strangeness that can pass for ordinary until we attend to it. It is strange for him to be in this place. I want to comment on two phrases in that poem. It is accomplished, and first of all, I want to say something about the orderly interests of the day. In this poem, what is inside the church is not the orderliness of a public ritual. It's a space that accommodates the strange, wild impulses that bring individuals inside. Ceremony was published in one of his pepper canister booklets, dated 2007. I'm tempted to see it as a reversal of an early section of another very fine poem, The Messenger, from 30 years earlier, a poem in memory of his father. And that poem, The Messenger, actually also moves in reverse. It starts at the end, so to speak, and goes back to the father's childhood. In that section I'm interested in, Kinsella recalls not being brought to church, as we might expect a well-behaved Irish child to be, but being marched out of a church in the middle of Mass, past everybody, during a sermon which offended his father because the priest was telling people how to vote. So the disorderly, angry and offensive is inside the building. And that early piece of The Messenger invokes a kind of desecration, not absolutely unrelated, I think, to the iconoclasm of the Reformation, which, if you remember, is where I started. But there's also, as in Ceremony, there's this relish for the fabric of the church, the stonework. The child is watching his reflection in the brawn marble, and the round shaft went up shining into a mouth of stone flowers. I'm discovering, I think, that poems that substitute for rituals may also substitute for other poems, and the reversals in Kinsella could be taken to be a special kind of difference. So, it is accomplished. something happens in ceremony. The kneeling before the altar has a past and a future. It works in stages. There was the impulse to enter, then there's the exit. The sense of accomplishment is the middle, the still point. What happens comes out of a lack, a sense of distance from the receive ritual, which prompts the poem to emerge instead. Now, I can't talk about this subject without referring to the way that ritual can exclude, and without speaking about the abjection, which is part of exclusion. And that brings us back to how we feel about the body and about buildings, and it also enables me to mention women poets and more poems from the same Irish mix, I suppose, as the Kinsella poem. Buildings, interiors and exteriors, prompt us to think about the barriers that define them and the ceremonies to be engaged in at those barriers, covering your head, removing your shoes, washing your hands. These don't, of course, belong entirely in religious contexts either. Traditional religion offers us some of the most resonant metaphors. The Hebrew Bible, of course, has a big range of examples of ritual purity and impurity, expressing a deep anxiety about the body's lack of stability. They don't refer just to the female body either, but the fertile female body does particularly attract that anxiety. So I want to talk a bit about a poem of Dorothy Malloy's, which I remember coming across in a typescript and the excitement with which we published it in Ciphers number 55, I checked. The poem, Cast Out, has a speaker who is probably female and an unclean antagonist, definitely female. And the two are bound together, one feeding or feeding off the other. The imagery from the Old Testament is about the ceremonial uncleanness of leprosy. The setting of the poem, on the other hand, is medieval, but its climate seems to me to be timeless. It's about an instinctive withdrawal from something that is felt to be reeking of pollution. She circles my walled city with her clappers and her cup. From battlement and organ loft, I throw her food to eat, unleavened bread, goat's cheese, the flesh of swine. The poem draws almost gleefully on the repertoire, piling up uncleannesses and, much worse, mixing the clean and unclean together. I sprinkle her with clay, ignore her cries. I turn away to ring the requiem bell. She joins the living dead. At Mass, I see her lean into the leper squint, receive from some gloved hand the sacred host. Now, this is a poem which is strongly exotic with its medieval imagery and its leper squint, but it also expresses a sense of, I think, visceral horror that is not antiquarian. I think that Dorothy Malloy had access to a kind of cave of the winds, a mental space where wild ideas we might want to dismiss to the past are shown to be alive and forceful. There are frightening pressures here, conjured and moulded, and the poem ends, I wear beneath my robe her running sores. So I wear, the present tense, it's not chosen lightly. I think this is what the Irish grammarians call a present habitual, beam rather than time, a present which is not a fluid moment, but a condition from which there is no escape. The ritual outcast and the unpolluted insider inside the walled city are bound together. And what I think the ritual poem does is it frees us from this stasis into a live present. Now, if the link between poetry and ritual is worth talking about, it is in part because we do live in a present precariously founded on a moving past, which supplies us with our scariest images and which hands down a sense of ritual propriety and impropriety, which also means, I repeat, that ritual exists apart from religious observance. I remember Anthony Cronin at a very cold graveside watching Sean O'Eiléan to see when he would put his hat on, because then he could put his on too. So that's I think something that has almost disappeared. Men hardly use their head coverings in ritual gestures anymore, but they used to. A ceremony to return to king's exequy that we have understandably lost touch with is the laying to bed of a new bride. It was a communal female ritual. Thomas More says, "The bride was brought to bed with honest women, as manner is in brides, you wot well." And the friend that he's telling the story to nods in acceptance. Yes, we know about that. Again, the Queen in Hamlet had looked forward to decking Ophelia's bride bed, instead of which she strews her grave. And King writes in the exequy, "So close the ground and about her shade, black curtains draw, my bride is laid." The other custom, I promised I would come back to his opening, the custom of bringing flowers to funerals is still with us, of course, transformed by Henry King into a strew of weeping verse. The exequy ends with the consciousness of the body in the present tense. "But hark, my pulse like a soft drum beats my approach, tells thee I come." The final proof of the body's instability is death. Another ancient ritual, and I almost hesitate to go on with this, but I will. Another ancient ritual is the holding of funeral games. So my last example, before wrapping up, is from Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill's poem, Oscailt Tuama, Opening the Tomb. This is a poem that's both archaic, it's quite a deliberately pagan poem, and also focused on the present, both in what it explicitly says, its reference to a custom which she says is still observed, therefore exists in the present, but also, of course, in its feminist undertow of demands on our understanding, that funeral games, which we read about as masculine and carried on to commemorate male heroes, can be also for females. In that poem, Oscailt Tuama, the old woman who sits up in her grave lively as ever after 100 years prescribes rituals for present and future generations, which have to do with purification and celebration. The Tuama le dúna ríis an driú lá is the Chuilleanáin doing gefuamantuil a scríbe sa scrava ó bhungabar is gan éon ruine salachar a ágantáin. We would have to close up the tomb on the third day, and she gave us all our orders to scrub it and polish it top to bottom and to leave no speck of dirt or dust in it. Is the Chuilleanáin na hórdathe a leag síos doing. So sí ar thullach, trí gár muite a ardú, a clichi cuinte a rachtáil gach blian an nuas go dtí an lá aniu féin, clichi cuinte na mór máthar a thugtar ortha san riamh ó hin, agus is I mí bhean óir a chomórtar iad ling. And we followed the directions she had laid down for us, to sit on a hilltop, to raise 3 shouts of praise, to hold her funeral games every year afterwards, down to the present day. The Great Mother's funeral games, they are called ever since, and it is in the month of September they are held with us today. So the presence of ritual in the present tense is imagined here as an ancestral secular injunction coming from a lively, though not living, forebear. It seems to me that life is full of such injunctions and orders. The trouble is, we can't obey them. They are debts we cannot pay. To write poems is not to claim that we can write off those debts, but to acknowledge them. The sense of a debt being due comes in part from the multitude of unfairnesses that crowd history. If we're still breathing and able to write and have a subject worth writing about, how can we balance that with the awfulness of all that has happened by chance and by deliberate action? Poetry does not balance, because if there were a balance, an equipoise, it would not need to move. Poetry is motion. It is made of language, and language exists in time, pushing its way forward through the contradictory impulses and flashes of awareness that we live in. Its greatest resource is negation, the registering of all that is missing, and it's the registering of what's missing, what's lacking, that leads us on to the fabrication of a ritual in verse. Thank you.